Hello and welcome again to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay and today our guest in the studio is Daniel Doen Silberberg. Hello Daniel.
Hi.
And Daniel has written a book called Wonderland, the Zen of Alice. And you've had quite a fascinating life following different traditions. But let's start when you were quite young, because something happened when you were around 9 years old which changed your view of reality, didn't it?
Yeah, I was living in New York, in the Bronx, and it was not a good neighborhood. And I went with my mother to the post office. And in those days, if the federal government had criminals at large, they had posters of them on the walls. So I was looking at them, and I was very young, and it was saying this one murdered people and this one robbed people, et cetera, et cetera. So when I came home, I was kind of scared, I guess, and I went to bed. And later, we had fire escapes, you know what they are?
Yes,
And,
I do, yeah.
outside the window, and then I couldn't go to sleep, and I was convinced that one of these public enemies was going to climb into my window. So I lay there kind of petrified. Right? And at that moment, I had a strange thought, something I guess was a thought, kind of. I realized that I didn't have to be me, that I was an entity that could be somebody else. It could be the person next door, or it could be my mother, or one of these criminals. But for some reason or other, that entity, that consciousness, that mind, was localized in me, and I, as me, as this consciousness, was the center of the world for me. And I realized that that was true for everyone. And then I had thoughts following that I couldn't put in words to myself. It had something to do about, somehow, the kind of conditioned thing about me being Daniel Silberberg, growing up, child, 9 years old, went away for a little bit. And I saw myself as just this entity. Later in Buddhism, I would have called, as I was a student, I would say I had a little glimpse into the true nature, called emptiness, or shunyata in Sanskrit. And yeah, and that was always a very kind of puzzling and interesting moment, and I really kind of got that there was something else other than what people understood, including myself.
It expanded something in you, is that right?
I saw something other. Yeah, expanded would be a good word, sure.
Yeah. Because actually, we were talking on the phone and you were saying you live in a pretty tough neighbourhood and there's some fights in the streets. And
Not
things.
now.
You had to be a tough kid then, didn't you?
Back then,
yes.
Now I live in a very peaceful neighborhood.
No, I mean when you were young, yeah.
Yeah, it was a tough neighborhood. At that time in New York is more civilized now. And this was the 50s, and you know, if you've ever seen a play like West Side Story, it was that time. And there were gangs, and you had to avoid, when you went out on the street, you had to avoid certain blocks, and certain blocks were owned by certain ethnic groups, and you did not pass through them, and there were minor wars and sometimes knifings and things like that. It's a little scary, yeah.
So you bought a book on the Buddhist Sutras when you were in your teens, and this was quite significant, wasn't it? Something drew you, I think, to this book, and you were quite intrigued by it.
Well, actually, I took a book first out of the library. My father, who was a wonderful man, was giving me an education, but an enforced one, and I had to sit on the couch, the worst part of which was that slip covers were in fashion those days, so you stuck to the couch. You didn't just sit on it. My mother said it. And I had to read Dostoevsky, Hugo, Turgenev, Dumas, an hour a day, every day. And later, when my father was beginning to be satisfied with that, he'd say I could pick something out myself as long as he approved of it. And I knew he approved of things that were hard to understand. So I found one of the Buddhist Sutras, and I brought it home from the library, and I asked my father if this was okay, and he looked at it and said yes. And I I read it, and I really couldn't understand it, but somehow it made me feel good. It struck a chord, and I asked my father how he felt about stuff like this, Zen, Buddhism. He said, good. And I didn't always listen to him, but it did encourage me.
So when you say it struck a chord, what do you mean by that?
Well, let me ask you a question. Are you asking me how I felt about it then, or how I would understand that now?
How you felt then?
Then, okay. It just made me feel good. From that space then, it just made me feel good. So from this space now, I say it was able to stop my thoughts.
It was able to stop your thoughts.
Yes. What the sutra was saying took me out of the realm of associative thought for a moment or two here and there.
Yeah.
And that felt good to me, going again to the other position of being there. It felt good to me. It felt, relieving. A feeling of like being free for a moment or relieved.
And where were you aware then that your thoughts were stopping for a second?
No.
No. Well, it took time afterwards for that you to realise that's what the process that had started.
Right. That's really accurate. After that, after there was a trail of such experiences, and then I began to read books that explained that, I was able to say, yeah, that's what happened. That's what happened. My conceptual mind shut off for a minute. I was out of the drama of my own life for a minute. And so after a while, it was, kind of like Hansel and Gretel. The breadcrumbs lined up for me, and I would have a way to describe it.
Because I hear that so many times that people would like to stop their thoughts, even for a few seconds. And it was a real gift that it happened to you. Okay, only very briefly, but it happened at quite a young age.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I felt like it was something special.
So, and then you were attracted by the Gurdjieff movement, and I think around 17,
Yes.
you became a student
Yes.
of a Gurdjieff group.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've never been in a Gurdjieff group. I have read quite a bit, and I know people that have, but it's regarded as quite an extreme, quite a difficult teaching to be involved in.
At that time, there was a revolution going on, both here in England and in America and other places. And it was the dawn of the beatniks were influential, and we were experimenting with psychoactive drugs too. And I had taken LSD and psilocybin. I think LSD was even legal at that time, and had some remarkable experiences. And I was lucky to fall in with a group of people who were interested in Gurdjieff, who took this drug experimentation quite seriously. I always find that phrase very funny, drug experimentation. People always experiment with drugs, but when it comes to alcohol, they're able to make a real commitment. But so anyway, they took the experimenting seriously, and we were taking a prescribed dosage of LSD, and somebody else would act as a guide and read Timothy Leary's version, translation of, he didn't translate it, someone else, but it was the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which is read to people upon when they've died, and taking you through the various states, the bardos. So we did that, and
So
that
you,
really...
So you read this after you've taken...
Well, somebody else
LSD.
would read it to me.
Okay.
And it was an amazing experience. So after that...
So describe it as you remember it. And you say an amazing experience. How was it amazing?
That's a good question. It was almost like my mind went on a tour of the world. It saw all the possibilities, or many of the possibilities, all is too strong a word, for the shapes that consciousness could take. And you felt you were almost seeing some things on the animal level, on the cellular level. And a complete tour. At the very end of it, I remember actually writing on a wall I am this. Now, if you look at Indian Vedantic writings, that they will even say that exactly, that that is the breakthrough experience, when you see I am this, that there's no separation between you and the environment, that everything is one thing. And that I was able to see later, but this was the first time that I really saw that clearly.
So it gave you a glimpse of something that you hadn't seen before.
Absolutely. A glimpse, but a very potent glimpse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then I went looking for books and stuff like that, and I found an informal Gurdjieff group. I had read In Search of the Miraculous, P.D. Ouspensky's book on Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way, and I just saw it as truth. I don't know, I think I would have seen it as truth without these psychedelic experiences too, but I saw it as truth. Him talking about us being asleep and mechanical and that we could wake up, because I knew I had woken up for moments, so I believed him. And then later I met some people who were involved with the Gurdjieff Foundation in New York, and I wanted to go to a foundation group, but I was very young. This is later, I was maybe 20, but this is still much too young to go there. And they gave me the name of one of the people. His name was James Wyckoff. He was an author. And I called James Wyckoff once a week, every week, I believe, for about a year. And every week he asked me to call back. And then at the end of the year, he said, okay, meet me at the Barbizon Hotel, which is on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. And I was very embarrassed because it was a models hotel. There were all these women walking around, very, models, and they're escorts in tuxedos, and I was kind of just a young.
But Gurdjieff would have liked this hotel, wouldn't he?
I guess he would have. I was kind of a young, more bohemian type, and felt very out of place. And then this person comes walking in with what was the Gurdjieff look in those days, I think of, which is an informal jacket, sneakers, and lots of books under your arm, slightly long hair. And he says, I'm James Wyckoff, and we go over to a coffee shop, and he sits down with me and says, okay, now what do you want?
And what did you want?
I wanted to learn. I wanted to join a Gurdjieff group. And he said, okay. He said, you're young. You may be the youngest we've ever taken in New York anyway. He said, but let's try it.
So what was driving this direction in you?
Well, Ian, honestly, anything I would say, I'd be making it up a little bit, It would be 20/20 hindsight. And I'm not even sure if that hindsight would be good, but for some reason, this idea that there was more to understand about life, that we understood a small degree, that not we, but I, was asleep, not awake, did not know what was possible, was compelling for me. I don't know why, really.
But that word compelling tells me a lot.
Yeah.
It's something you had to follow somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And how was this more advanced group different from the one you'd been in beforehand?
Well, the other one was led by somebody I think who had had some experience, but it was limited, very limited. And this was the Gurdjieff Foundation. This was the actual institute that Gurdjieff had set up internationally under the direction of, I think, Madame de Salzman, and New York under Lord Pentland. And this was organized and serious, and much more serious, and much more adult. I felt quite out of place. They were all older than me, and they were very smart too.
And what form did the meetings take?
I started to go to meetings with it was a couple, it was downtown in Manhattan, very early in the morning, and sometimes at this point I was working as a musician, so I really didn't even go to bed. I just came into the meeting. And you would come in and you would sit quietly, and then the group leader or leaders would come in, and you'd stand when they came in, and sit down again, and then it was completely quiet, and the a question was needed in order for it to move forward. So one of the students would ask a question, and then it would be answered, and then it would go on like that. It was all on a question and answer basis. And if you look at some of the books, like Ouspensky's books, there's a record of that, how that's done. At the end, the group leader might say something. In this case, I was in a group with a married couple, and either one might say something, but basically it was a question and answer format.
And you felt you were progressing during this time. Presumably that's why you stayed in it.
The idea of just being accepted to do this and being able to come to this meeting connected directly with Gurdjieff was more than I hoped for. So I was very happy to be allowed to be there.
Were you aware of changes happening in yourself?
I was aware, yeah, I was aware of being stimulated, and part of the practice of Gurdjieff, wherever it came from, noticed something very interesting, which was that with all the best of intentions to be conscious, we forget. So he speaks of remembering yourself or observing yourself, and so you engage in certain activities with the teacher, with the group, with yourself, so that you remember to attempt to work on yourself, you attempt to be conscious. Going to those meetings greatly strengthened my resolve and my ability to remember to do that, and also they gave me exercises to do on a daily basis. So yes, it really helped.
So I'm just remembering, I think it was really one of the Ouspensky books, he made a commitment to do self-remembering.
Yes.
And then he remembered 48 hours later, he made the commitment and he completely forgot about it in 48
That's right.
hours.
That's exactly what happens.
That must be something that happens a lot in the early days.
Oh, it happens forever. It's
yeah.
Something I tell my students now is that I think is, I hope, helpful. I think that in general, at least me and others, I think, when we think of working for consciousness or finding out who we are and changing ourselves, we somehow are in kind of a digital mode. We think we're going to either 0 or 100%. And I think that a person who's able to impact their own original psyche to 10% is a very large change, very large. So and I think it's really good to put that out there, because people get discouraged when they try to practice in whatever form. They try to practice and they expect such huge change and so fast and so dramatically that they in fact stop, when if it was done and taught with a little more humility for the human condition, that we might be able to stick at it longer and actually reach a more meaningful stage.
So self-remembering, very simply, is basically being aware of your actions, your thoughts. Is that right? Is that?
No,
okay.
It's on two levels. There's a kind of self-remembering where you're self-aware, but the deeper form that Gurdjieff was really talking about, self-remembering, is deeper. It's remembering who you really are. It's what I had a glimpse of when I was 9.
Yes, but unless you have a reference point, it's
Right.
not really possible, is it?
Right.
But you had the gift of the reference point.
Well, and I had good people teaching me who were. I was very impressed with the sincerity and efforts and kindness of the teachers there. Good people teaching me. Good, much older than me. And they're probably my age, or a little bit younger, and I was 20. So they were kind. I remember when I was tired, or they'd ask me after the meeting, to come over, Daniel, what's going on? Are you okay? And I really appreciate the kind of attention they gave me and the kindness of their spirit.
Okay, so you stayed in the Gurdjieff school for, I think, altogether around 15 years.
Well, when I was involved with the foundation group, I, somewhere around that, I won't get the chronology exactly right, but I was married and my wife died. And a couple of things happened after that. I got where I couldn't really work with the kind of exercises they wanted me to do. I was just barely surviving. And I also knew that I did not want to stay in New York City. That was bad for me. I wanted to move out to the country and away from everything. So I stopped going to the institute there. I remember speaking to one of the teachers before I left, and he said, he was very nice. He said, "You're young, you've got a long time. You obviously have a penchant for this kind of thing. You're going to be doing it, so don't worry about it." So I moved to upstate New York, but strangely enough, almost as soon as I moved, well, to make a long story short, I didn't have any work, so I was doing some construction work, and I had my Gurdjieff book with me, and I was reading it, and there were these workmen around me, and before I knew of it, one of them comes over to me and says, "Hello, friend," and he said, "You like the book?" I said, "I like the book." I said, "Did you read it?" He said, "Of course I read it." And they were also students of Gurdjieff with another teacher, Alex.
Isn't that remarkable?
So I just got off the bus, and I got right back on.
But you were attracted to something more, I was going to say extreme, probably more committed would be the right word, and you decided to leave and go to a Zen monastery.
Well, after I had been, it was maybe 15 years since I started with Gurdjieff, with the Fourth Way. I corresponded with Willem Nyland, who was trustee of the Gurdjieff Foundation, who had split off, and he had a place in upstate New York. And I visited him and corresponded with him for a while, and then one day I visited him and I asked him if it would be all right if I led a group up in Woodstock where I was. And he said yes. And that he would supply materials for me, etc. And I, being young, said, could I also just teach some of what I've learned myself? And he said yes. And so I started to do that. And then I was 33 years old. And after doing that for a little while, I said, something in me said, I'm too young, and I don't know enough yet. And people are asking me some very profound questions, and I don't really want to mislead them. Now, part of the reason I was like that is I've seen other teachers who had a greater interest in being in the teacher role. I don't know that I had such a strong interest in that. I had an interest in being in the student role, actually, more. I wanted to learn. I still do. And so I felt not completely right that. So I said, I want to do more. By the time that I will teach, I said, but by the time that I teach, I want to really feel very solid in myself. I don't want to feel like I'm still a kid, and I want to understand what I'm teaching and feel good about it. So I said, I'm going to go study something else, yes. And then I disbanded my group. I wound up going to Zen Mountain Monastery and said to my group, if you'd care to come with me, please do. And 6 or 7, 8 of them did come with me.
And that was more committed because you say in your book you started meditating at 4:30 in the morning.
That was a monastery.
Yeah.
That was really rough.
This was the real deal.
It was the real deal.
Yeah.
And that particular monastery, Zen Mountain Monastery, is considered the boot camp of American monasteries. It's the roughest and most severe program and all of that.
Yeah, I'm just wrote out a quote from your book. For a while, the practice was a torture.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So what keeps? I'm always interested. What keeps you going through that? Is it just kind of you're just so determined to get through it, or is there also like this feeling, if I get through this, then maybe freedom awaits? What is it that drives you to that situation?
That's accurate, I think. I believed it was almost kind of a scientific analysis. I said to myself, Gurdjieff practice is done with people kind of practicing as they walk around. And I said, if I sit down in a seated posture and try to find out who I am for hour after hour after hour, the likelihood of that happening is, I think, good. If it's possible, this would be the way to do it. If I were looking for a cure for cancer and I kept looking through the microscope 24 hours a day, I would be more likely to find it than if I were just looking through it 1 hour a day. So I believed in this method. I also noted that what I read in Zen books I did not understand, and that was a good sign, because one day I was sitting and just thinking, and I'd been doing all this searching. And remember I was sitting, strangely enough, on the lawn of Harvard Divinity School in Cambridge. And I said, if the answers were in the conceptual mind, I'd have found them by now. So obviously the answers I'm looking for are not in the conceptual mind. And of the things I read, Zen and also Tibetan Buddhism seemed to not be in that area, and I knew there was something there that I definitely, didn't understand.
Because you worked a lot with Cohens, didn't you?
Later.
That was later.
Yeah. Yeah, once I started Zen, yes.
Yes, yes.
It was Daido Roshi and Maizumi Roshi, and we did a Cohen System. We did hundreds of koans.
Yeah.
By the time I finished my formal study, I think I'd done about 600, 650 koans over 25 years.
Yeah. So for people that don't know, what is a koan?
Well, the word koan comes from the Chinese kanji, the characters, for public case. Kind of like if the Supreme Court had made a ruling, except this is a spiritual ruling. So some master in the 8th or 12th century says this dialogue is really the level of the Dharma that is profound. And in order to understand this level, you can understand this koan, but not understand experience, and that will be a good training for you. So koans are questions or dialogues that become questions that the student has to answer from their experience, not intellectually.
And how did you find that?
Great. Aside from the fact that you don't really want to, I don't think anybody wants to go into a room with your teacher at 4:30 in the morning, or 4:30 or 5, and start a pass-fail kind of thing. You're not in the mood for that at that time of the morning. So that part, it was difficult.
So it was like going to examination and you think you might have the answer, you sit with the teacher and you say what comes, and then he says whether you passed or not.
Well, basically, as I do now, the teacher sits there with a stick and a bell. And this was John Daido Roshi, generally. Each teacher has a different way of doing this. And you say, my name is, and I'd say, my name is Doen. That was my Buddhist name. And I'd say, my koan is, all things return to the One. To what does the One return? All things return to the One. To what does the One return to? What does the One return to? And Daido Roshi would lean forward and say, so Doen, what does the One return to? And you would, a lot of times the answers are verbal, or not, they can be both verbal or nonverbal. They can be a demonstration. And then he would either say, go on to the next one, or he'd ring his bell and say, that misses it. And then you have to leave.
How did you feel then?
At first it was hard. I got used to it. Sometimes Maizumi Roshi, who was the founder and the abbot, because he didn't see us as often, he was a little more explanatory. But he tended to explain once you got it right. Then he'd say, yes. One of the most remarkable things that Maizumi Roshi did, they're both dead now. I don't remember what the koan was I answered a koan, and he said, in his quiet Japanese kind of accent, you'd have to lean really close to him, and he'd say, Doen, it's not Buddhism.
See, I want to ask you the answer. What is the one return to?
As I would present that as a koan, or as, do you want an explanation?
What does the one return to?
To Diet Coke.
What do you feel now as you look at me?
I was kind of taking pleasure in your reaction to it. So, yeah, koan study was very interesting. It kept going on. And then I finished a koan study with Genpo Roshi.
So you went from the monastery to work with Genpo Roshi?
I stayed at the monastery for, there was some breaks, but on and off. We lived at the monastery for 5 years. I met my wife there, who was a Buddhist monk, Karen, and who is a very good Zen student. I wish she would teach, but she doesn't want to. And that was probably the most important thing that's happened to me in my life. And Maizumi Roshi, who was the abbot, married us. And then we wanted to be out of the monastic setting. You know, we were married, so after 5 years, so we looked for a house right nearby, so we could still do the schedule and do some work to support ourselves, but not a lot. And so all in all, we wound up studying with Daido Roshi for 16 years. Maizumi died, and then after that, there was maybe a year off, and we wanted to continue studying. And then I knew Genpo Roshi from way back. He had visited Zen Mountain Monastery, and I called him up, and I wanted to go study with him. He taught in Europe a lot. It's the sort of the karma of why I'm here today, because of his teaching in Europe. And but he was teaching in Utah, and I didn't know how to get there. I did retreats there, but my work was in the East, and so was Karen's, and I had practice as a psychotherapist, and she had one, and she had a practice as a lawyer. She was a lawyer, and we didn't know how we'd get out there. And then I contracted a disease called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which paralyzes you. And
was that a result, do you think, to some extent, of being in the monastery?
No. It was a result probably of a flu shot, a reaction to a flu shot. It's rare, but it's not unknown.
I heard of it, yeah.
So then I got paralyzed for a while, and because of that...
But let's not just run over that, because that's huge. You got paralyzed for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd been learning Gurdjieff groups for 15 years, Zen Monastery 50 years, 30 years,
Mm-hmm.
and you get paralyzed.
Mm-hmm.
So how is it to be paralyzed with that training? It must help you enormously.
It was then that I realized how, I would say until then I really didn't get how important it was. Because the ability, like what was going on with Gyanbare was also that you could get more and more paralyzed. I had a nice head to foot paralysis, but your lungs can get paralyzed and your eyes.
So what your mind could do in that situation.
Could do quite a lot of things you wouldn't want it to do. So I found that because I had that training that I could do some things with my mind, and I was okay.
So what did you do?
I was able to drop thought, back to the original experience.
So how do you drop thought?
Well, that's like saying in a way, if I say to myself, how do I drop thought? It's like me saying to myself, how do you eat? Or how do you make love? It's not a kind of a, step-by-step instruction thing. It's a practice thing. So if you're doing meditation on a daily basis and you're doing a lot of it or even some of it, you're in the practice of learning how to drop thought. And so then when a such situation arises, it's a whole body response, it's not a, and I knew how to do it already. I was highly motivated to do it.
So what you're saying, in effect, is you could separate from your mind. So you are watching your mind, is that right?
No, a little different than that. If I may, like a little conceptual. Mind, as I see it, and I think most Zen teachers see it, is not the contents of the mind. It's the consciousness. It's mind, not the content of the mind. So what I could do was drop the content of the mind. You can't drop mind.
So the mind is still generating whatever mind does.
Yes.
And in a way, there's a disassociation going on.
Well, let's look at like an analogy I think is good. If mind is like an ocean, right? And then the ocean is generating waves according to circumstances, according to, just like the ocean would generate waves according to gravity, weather. So we generate things associatively due to our past experience.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in dropping thought, what I was doing was a particular wave would come up. And let's say this wave was, okay, you're going to be blind tomorrow. Maybe. So I'd say, well, so understanding that there was no use dwelling on that thought, I was able to drop that thought. And then other waves might come. But in general, also, the waves would be quiet,
Yes.
not, the amplitude would not be so great.
So it's a process of, first of all, understanding the way the mind works, and then realizing that you don't have to energize or support the wave when it comes. Is that correct?
Well, I think that if you look back at the history, the understanding is not so necessary because there were people, who had very little understanding of how the mind worked, say in the 4th and 5th century, but they did understand how to drop thought in the same way that maybe they understood how to bend the body and do yoga. They just had been practiced through an apprenticeship and could do that.
Yeah.
Now we today, you and I, have more understanding of how to do that, but it's possible to really do it without understanding too.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I think you actually broke your, just as you were starting to get better from from being paralyzed, you broke your foot.
That was near the beginning. The first treatment looked like it was called plasmapheresis, and it's basically pumping your blood through your body and removing the white blood cells, if I understand that correctly. And so they thought I was getting better, and then I got up. I remember it was Christmas Eve, and I got up, and there was a little party, and I fell right down on my leg and broke my leg. And the next day, Christmas Day, which is not a good day to be in the hospital because nobody wants to be working there. And I was in the hospital, so now I had Guillain-Barré and a broken leg. So.
Yeah, the double test.
Yeah, it was interesting. I wonder if it wasn't a greater test for my wife, who had to do everything with no support at that point. And Karen eventually, so eventually we said, we got nothing really happening for us back here, so let's go out to Utah and study with Genpo. And she drove, I couldn't walk yet. And we came to Salt Lake City, Utah, not a place that we were particularly interested in, but to study. And I couldn't even look at the house we were renting. And they would carry me into, in Salt Lake Zen Center, the Zendo, the place we meditate, is on the second floor.
Yeah.
So they'd have to carry me in my wheelchair in there, but I'd go every morning and sit, and they'd carry me up there, and they'd carry me down. And then we were there, and then eventually I began to walk again. Yeah.
I'm aware the time is going by. We have about 15 minutes left. And I mentioned your book at the beginning. What was behind writing this book? And just tell us very briefly how you see the book.
Well, Iain, I had 15 years of Gurdjieff and 25 years of Zen before I taught. And this book was written maybe a couple of years into teaching. And in my mind, what I understood that I thought was important was that one can have a pretty good grasp of the intellectual, the Dharma, the theory. One can even have profound experiences. And the practice can still not be really real in a certain way, because people will have those experiences and that history, and there's still another word, which is embodiment, and that takes integrity. You have to have a desire, and you take those vows, but you have to take them seriously. You have to have that desire to really make the practice real, to really embody the ideals, what you've seen, what you've experienced. We all have our egos and our demons. It's easy to get stuck in enlightenment as such and feel that anything you do is correct, which is a very dangerous thing. And so at that time, I think, is where what the most important thing is, to embody the teaching and to carry out the precepts you've taken. And that has to do with ideals and integrity in relationship to other people, and how you lead your life, how you lead your marriage, how you work, how you raise your children. So that's what this book came out of. I wanted to talk about that.
Yes, because we all, in a way, I think everybody in a way has certain realizations, and then unless you integrate that into how you live your life, somehow those realizations are empty, aren't they?
Not very meaningful. That's right. And the first thing, I think, that you have to, it's so strange, it's so simple. In order to integrate it into your life and to embody it, the first thing that has to happen is you have to want to. You have to want to. That, not that you have gained some kind of spiritual materialism where you feel good about yourself, or you feel good because you're a teacher, or people love you, or whatever, but somewhere in there, where this all started for us, we have to get back to that and say, now I really, really want to embody this teaching, and I want to make this teaching real, and I want to have some integrity in the Dharma and teaching and my students. And that's, to me, the fulcrum that this book came out of.
And how does Alice fit into this?
Well, Alice, I started talking on Alice early. I liked Alice. I'm a reader. I like literature. My first degree is in English literature. And so I like, and I write, So Alice was a good vehicle. But the thing about Alice that makes it such a good vehicle is that Alice falls into a world in which all the rules are suddenly changed. In short, she loses her story. She loses her identity, in a way. And I thought it was a really perfect metaphor for talking about Zen and my training and all of our training. And so little interchanges like when Alice is talking to, I think it's the caterpillar, or it's either the caterpillar or the cat, and says, "Where should I go from here?" And the caterpillar says, "That entirely depends on where you want to wind up." You might say that's the most important sentence in this book.
Mm.
Where you go from here depends on where you want to wind up. And I guess I wanted to wind up teaching to a group of people where I could transmit that kind of embodiment and a real idea of integrity of the teaching.
Mm.
So, Alice was a good vehicle for it.
No, it's a novel. It's an interesting idea,
Mm-hmm.
because that's right. She fell down the hole and lost her identity. I know that happens to certain people.
And her
happens.
logic. She saw the end of her logical abilities. Yeah, please.
Yeah, it happens to people sometimes, and it's can be very scary if you have no knowledge of what's happening. The consensus reality that we all learn doesn't always stack up for people. Something changes, and then they feel really they're falling down a hole, and where are they?
And perhaps, as we were talking before, in my mind, it's perhaps if they know everything about what's going on, it's even scarier than not knowing.
Well,
If you don't know, you have some motivation for learning something new. But if you think you know everything,
Yeah.
and that happens, then that's the scariest of all situations. Huh?
Mm. Yeah. So how is your process these days? Is it an ongoing process in terms of deepening?
Well, a lot of what I'm doing now is I have students. I have students in the States and students in Europe, and I just came to see them and work with them. So a lot of my group is called Lost Coin, and all the Lost Coin students, which is a particular approach to the Dharma, really makes me consider what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, how to teach them, what I consider appropriate teaching in this day and age, and trying to shed a lot of the both the medieval aspects, which are still there, the hierarchical, the abuses of power, the monastic form, which we're not engaged in. People talk about Zen, they say chopping wood and carrying water. Well, that was fine in the 8th century. We don't do that anymore. If you're going to be one with your life, you have to be one with the life we live today, not the life of the 8th century. So this kind of consideration about how to teach and what to teach, and my dialogue with my students is a lot of what's making me really look and examine how to do this right. And what is appropriate. Something I've seen is that, when you read books, they're very grandiose. Like you hear phrases like endless compassion. Now, those people who have the endless compassion, they must be hiding in a room somewhere in Kansas, because I haven't met them yet. So I think I try to start my students with more just like basic human kindness, sensitivity, civility, right from the beginning as they're learning more ultimate truths. I think that's important. I think that the Dharma can become just another way of people really just doing what people do. So the grandioseness is not, as I said also before, so the phrase in Sanskrit, Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, is complete unexcelled enlightenment. Now the people that have gotten that complete unexcellable enlightenment are in the same room in Kansas with the people that have boundless compassion, and I hope they're having a good time. But I don't see it that way. I'd like to start from something that really can be embodied and not be so far removed that it's intimidating to people and untruthful too. We can have a really solid, deep practice, but we don't have to make it grandiose, I don't think. I think a really good pioneer of that was Trungpa Rinpoche, who always insisted, even though he was a little crazy himself maybe, but he always insisted on taking it right to practice, right down to earth, with our, right here, in this place. I mean, that's what the book's about. Right here in this place, which is enlightenment. And that's what the book is about, that this place itself is the other shore. This place is Wonderland. Wonderland isn't somewhere over there. When our mind is not always seeking something or afraid or pain, this becomes the other shore here. And that's really what I'm writing about.
Yeah, I think you say a couple of times in the book that the mind left to its own devices is not a very, these are not your words, but my interpretation is not a very intelligent vehicle left to its own devices.
You did a really good reading of the book. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's a quagmire.
Well, we have 2 minutes left.
Okay.
Anything you want to say in the last 2 minutes?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the trouble you've taken in preparing for the interview and really knowing my work. And I think what I'd like to say most, thank you for what you're doing on the show. And I'm flattered and happy to be here. And I don't think you can really, I can't really say about myself what I'm doing. I don't understand it myself. I'm hoping that as time goes by that I understand what I'm doing or not. Or not.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
So, thank you for coming along to Conscious TV, Daniel. I'm going to show the book again, Wonderland, the Zen of Alice, which I really enjoyed. And there's also a German translation, which I won't attempt to pronounce, but roughly the same title. I think there's also a Korean version and a Japanese one coming, so it's certainly growing. Thank you everyone for watching Conscious TV, and I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.